Hi guys, it's Jess from Honest Fiction, and welcome back to my channel. So today, I'm going to be sharing the top 10 romances that I read in 2022. Alright guys, so first of all, I just think it's absolutely insane that this is the first year I actually officially started reading romance. So prior to 2022, I was reading fantasy, YA fantasy, high fantasy, and then fantasy romance. Now, fantasy romance is still my favorite, but I do really enjoy romance. I am so happy that I've fallen into this community and just are reading these books. I absolutely love romance. It is now one of my top genres, and it's been great. So great that actually it was really hard for me to pick a top 10 for this year. I feel like I kept going back and forth on the books I wanted to pick for my top 10 reads of 2022 in the romance genre. And I think I finally narrowed it down, but there are just so many amazing books I've read this year. It was really difficult. But anyway, I am so excited to talk about these books with you guys. So if you are unfamiliar with my channel, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. You can also hit that notification bell to be notified whenever I post new bookish content. You can also check out my Instagram and Goodreads, both linked down below. With all that out of the way, let's talk about my top 10 romances of the year. Also, I forgot to mention, so these are gonna be my top 10 romance standalones. I will be doing a separate video of my top 10 romance series that I read this year. That video should be out a week after this one. So anyway, these books are in no particular order. They're just my top 10 romances of the year. Starting off, we have For Lucy by Julie Ann. I was not prepared for the emotional gut punch of this book. Have tissues ready. This is super emotional and just sad, but also heartwarming, and I loved it. So we were following Emmett and Tatum. So one day, Emmett is at a bar, and he sees this very attractive girl walk in, and she ends up walking right up to him, introduces herself as Tatum, and says that she is meeting her blind date. So she's assuming Emmett is the blind date, and Emmett doesn't correct her. So they go out, they have their date, they're getting along really well, and eventually Emmett has to admit that, hey, I wasn't the guy you were supposed to meet, but I like you. So after convincing Tatum that he is not a complete creep, they end up dating and eventually get married and have a daughter and are just having this wonderful life. They're so in love. And then tragedy strikes, something happens, and their relationship becomes completely fractured. So they end up divorcing. However, they still have to stay in communication because they are co-parenting their daughter, Lucy. And eventually, I think it's like 5 years later or even more than that, Tatum ends up dating a doctor. So now Emmett has to watch the woman that he's never fallen out of love with another man, and it was so good. So I will say, check trigger warnings for this. There is death of a child, and it was very upsetting. Doesn't happen on page, but still, check trigger warnings. It was super emotional, but I loved this book so much, and more people need to read it. I don't hear a lot of people talking about this book, but one of my top faves of the year, so definitely pick it up. Next up we have a student-teacher romance, and there's actually a few student-teacher romances on this list, which is really funny because I refused to read student-teacher romances until this year. I work in schools and I just felt uncomfortable reading them. However, they are now one of my new favorite types of romances if they are done correctly, and I feel like this one was. So this is Dark Notes by Pam Godwin. I will say I had a hard time choosing between this and Sea of Ruin because I read both of them this year and both of them are phenomenal, so definitely check out Sea of Ruin if you haven't yet. But Dark Notes, it's just so good. We are following Ivory and Emmerich. Now, Ivory is just living in this horrible family situation. She's living in poverty. However, she is able to go to this very prestigious school where she practices the piano. Her father was a pianist and she wants to become one as well. So the people in the school, some of the other students are really taking advantage of Ivory's situation, and she just has a terrible life. So one day, Emmerich is a new teacher and he is starting in Ivory's school, and he immediately kind of is intrigued by Ivory. And then he ends up seeing something happen between her and another student. He gets very upset, and he ends up having Ivory come live with him. And it is their romance. It does have some BDSM elements, and it's dark, but it's great. I really enjoyed this. There is a death of a animal towards the end of this book. It is a spoiler. I'm gonna let you know now because I am one of those people that I really appreciate when people tell me that is in a book just so I can avoid it. So that is towards the end of this book. Just know that going in. But this story is it's so good. I love Ivory and Emmerich's relationship and just how he's able to really heal her, and it's amazing. So highly, highly recommend. And next up, we have another second chance romance, and that is Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. I have already raved about how much I love this book, and I'm just going to continue to do so. This book is so good. We are following Yasmin and Josiah, and when we first see them, they are young and in love. Josiah ends up randomly proposing to Yasmin just on a whim, just because he loves her so much, and they're planning their future together, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And then the next chapter, they now have 2 kids, they own this restaurant together, but they're divorced, and through glimpses of the past throughout the book, we're able to see what led them to end up breaking up and divorcing, and it's so emotional just because you know these 2 people still have such strong feelings for each other, but because of a tragic event, it just caused this huge rift between them. And this book really emphasizes like mental health and having to heal yourself before you're able to help your partner, and it was beautifully done. I will say, once again, check trigger warnings. There are very upsetting things that happen throughout this book, but I think they are just handled so beautifully. So definitely, if you have not read this yet, check it out. This is my first book I ever read by Kennedy Ryan. It will not be my last. It was just an amazing read. All right, so next up we have Sicko by Amo Jones. So I debated putting this on my top reads of 2022. However, I've never read a book quite like this. Like, I've read a book that had similar tropes, but this book was just a complete, like, mind F. I had no idea what was going on until, like, the very end. So this is a foster sibling motorcycle club, very dark romance. Definitely check trigger warnings. We are following Royce and Jade. I really even can't get too much into the plot because it's going to give away spoilers, but Jade ends up being adopted by Royce's family, and Jade has a huge crush on her foster brother. They are just insanely close. One night, things start to kind of escalate when they're both teenagers, but the next day, Royce just disappears. And now we're kind of following Jade's story, and they meet up again as adults, and like what happened, and it was crazy. I ended up reading this book in like one sitting just because I was like, what is going on here? But I really enjoyed it. If you haven't read Amo Jones yet, definitely check this out. This was the first book I read by her, and it's so far my favorite. I've read 2 others, haven't been as crazy. Apparently there's a sequel to this, or a companion novel to this, Wicked, which I need to pick up ASAP. But anyway, definitely check this out. One of my top reads of 2022. And this next book I've already talked about a lot on my channel, so I'm going to keep this pretty brief. We have The Words by Jade. Now, I know this book is super long, however, it is so good. So we are following Lennon and Phoenix, and Phoenix is this like troubled kid. He has a really bad home life with his father. His father is very abusive, and he's just like the popular bad boy. He wants to be a musician, and he's kind of a loner. He does have dyslexia, and he's not doing too well in school. So his teacher says that he needs a tutor, so she asks Lennon to tutor him. Now, Lennon is this girl whose father, I believe, is like a music composer, and she doesn't have a lot of self-confidence. She's really picked on in school, and she has a pretty big crush on Phoenix. Now, they end up, like I said, Lennon ends up tutoring Phoenix, and then they start to kind of have this spark, and it soon turns into like a friends that eventually become lovers romance until Phoenix does something that just utterly devastates Lennon. He really betrays her, and they lose communication. So now years go by, and Lennon ends up being hired to pretty much babysit and make sure Phoenix stops his partying ways. And it's a friends to lovers, second chance romance, and it is just so good. I love this book. It's just, I can't even like put into words why I love this book so much, but it was so good. So highly recommend. I know it's long, but it's totally worth reading. And next up, we have another student-teacher romance. This is actually guidance counselor teacher, but I absolutely loved this book. It is Sweet Dandelion by Micalea Smeltzer. This is following Dandelion. So when she is in school, something very horrible takes place that really has a negative impact on her. She ends up having to move in with her older brother, and when she switches schools, the new school says she has to see a guidance counselor to kind of deal with her PTSD. Now, this guidance counselor happens to be Lachlan. He is this very attractive, younger guidance counselor, and he happens to live in the same building as Dandelion, and they end up hitting it off, and it's their relationship. And at first, I was like, ooh, this hits a little too close to home. I don't love a guidance counselor and patient. I feel like you're giving, as a patient, you're like giving a lot of trust into this guidance counselor. So I thought I was going to absolutely hate this book. However, I never felt like Lachlan was taking advantage of Dandelion. If anything, Dandelion was coming on really strong to Lachlan. But I love this. And I feel like towards the end of this book, Lachlan really gives Dandelion the time she needs to figure out if this is the relationship for her. And it was so good. So highly recommend. This is one of my absolute favorite student-teacher romances. Next up is a rockstar romance, and I find myself thinking about this book all the time. It was just so impactful, and I loved it. I loved it so much. So that is No Tomorrow by Carian. So this is following Piper and Blue. So Piper is working at this kind of mundane job. One day she goes to sit on this bench and eat her lunch like she does every day, and she sees this guy, and he is playing music on a guitar. He has long hair, super attractive, has his dog with him, and she ends up striking up conversation. So she ends up finding out that this guy's named Blue, and he's actually homeless, but that doesn't stop her from pursuing a relationship with him. And it is their story spanning, I think, like 14 years, and so much happens, and you really feel for Piper, but you're also so frustrated with her decision making. And then you have Blue, and this does deal with like some mental health things, and it was so good. So highly recommend. This is very emotional. I would also kind of check trigger warnings for this. My one critique of this book is I was, like I said, super frustrated with Piper. But besides that, I love this story, and I just think it's absolutely beautiful. My favorite book by far by Carian. So definitely, if you haven't yet, check this out. And next up is a mafia romance. So I knew I wanted to include at least one mafia romance on this list, only because I've read a ton of mafia romance this year, and I ended up picking Little Dove by Layla Frost. Now, I don't know what it is about this book, why I love it so much. I've already reread it twice, and I've recommended this to friends, and they've absolutely hated it, and that is okay. I personally just really like it. So we are following Maximo and Juliet. Juliet is this girl that is living with her father. Her father is very negligent. He likes to bet on MMA fights, and Juliet just really has to take care of herself. So one day she's scrounging looking for food in her own house. She hears the door bang open, so she hides in the cupboard, and then she hears a gunshot, and when she emerges, she sees Maximo, and he just killed her father. So she freaks out, runs, Maximo kidnaps her, and Juliet believes that Maximo is going to kill her. Instead, he takes her back to his very lavish mansion, where he gives her an amazing education, gives her whatever she wants to eat, takes care of her, and she has a great life for the next year. So then, after the year goes by, Juliet turns 18, and Maximo has a proposition for her. He is a dominant, he wants a new submissive, and asks Juliet to do that. Now, I would say this is kind of like taking advantage of his authority over her because he did kind of kidnap her, but he does say if she disagrees and doesn't want to do this, he will set her up for life in her own apartment and she can just go on her way. So anyway, Juliet agrees, and it is their relationship, and I loved it. I will say, this has daddy kink. I hate daddy kink. One of my least favorite kinks ever. It just icks me out. I loved it in this for some reason. No idea why. It just worked in this. But anyway, I really enjoyed this book. One of my favorite mafia romances of the year. All right, so for this next author, I realize that some people love this author, some people hate this author. Some people believe that this author doesn't write romance, but she writes women's lit, and I'm sure that I just gave away who the author is. Now, personally, I think I kind of agree with that. It really depends on what book we're talking about. Her books are very emotional, and they can sometimes lean a little bit more to women's lit. However, this book was the one released this year. I loved it. I thought it was so good. I cried. I read it in a day. And that is Reminders of Him by Colleen Hoover. So this is following Kenna. And after a very upsetting event, she ends up having to go to jail. Now, she is pregnant, so she has to give up her baby to her deceased boyfriend's parents when she enters jail. And she serves her, I think, 4 or 5 years. And when she's released, she just wants to have a relationship with her daughter. Now, the people that currently have custody of her daughter want nothing to do with Kenna and are just trying to raise this child. So when Kenna moves to their small hometown, they are just not welcoming. So Kenna ends up meeting this guy, Ledger, and they end up having a one-night stand, only for Kenna to find out that Ledger used to be her ex-boyfriend's best friend and is also very close with her daughter. So it is their story, and I just think it was done very well. We really get to see why each character feels the way they do and see their motivations. So their motivations could seem cruel from one side, but you totally understand why they're doing it and what caused them to feel this way. And it was so good, and I loved it. So highly recommend. I really enjoyed this. I know It Starts With Us was also released this year. However, I did prefer this book a little bit more. It just felt like a more complete story, and definitely recommend if you are a fan of Colleen Hoover. All right, guys, and as I'm filming this, I just realized I failed, and I did include 2 books by the same author. So we have The Confidence of Wildflowers by Micalea Smeltzer, which is the same author that wrote Sweet Dandelion. However, I loved both books. So this is also age gap romance. We are following Salem, and at the start of the story, she is about to graduate high school. Now, she's had the same boyfriend for pretty much all of high school. She's working in her mother's shop, and she really doesn't know what she's gonna do once she graduates. So then Thayer moves in next door. He is a single father, architect, and he ends up asking Salem to be his babysitter for his son, and it's their relationship. And oh my goodness, the angst, it's so good. So like I said, at the beginning of this story, Salem does have a boyfriend, so there is cheating in this. So if you're not a fan of reading about cheating, maybe don't pick this up. Also check trigger warnings. There's a very upsetting and traumatic event that happens very near the end of this book, and it's upsetting. So definitely check trigger warnings, but I just loved Thayer and Salem's relationship. He built her a home gym. Like, I want that level of commitment from a guy. This is also the first in a duology. Personally, I preferred this first book, and the second book I think I only rated 3 stars, but this first one was so good, which is why it is on this list. But definitely, if you like age gap romances, definitely pick this up. All right, guys, those are my top 10 romances I read this year. Please let me know down in the comments below, what is your favorite romance that you read this year? And yeah, I said this already, I post new videos every Thursday and Sunday, and if you haven't yet, please like and subscribe. I will see you all next week. Bye.